Pimax recently sent me their flagship VR headset in the Crystal range. It is the Crystal Super. It has been from the get-go for me an eye-opening experience, and one I just can't get enough of. It's hard to put this headset down. Such is the enjoyment that I've gotten from flying DCS World, which is one of the more demanding flight simulation games on the market. Like its two predecessors, the Crystal and the Crystal Light, the Super delivers a superb visual experience thanks to its high resolution, ultra sharp 3840 by 3840 resolution per eye QLED lenses. Remember, these are glass spheric lenses. They provide a large sweet spot according to Pimax. There is an ultra clear optional optical engine. There are two sets of lenses that you can buy. There's an optional separate purchase of 57 pixels per degree with up to 120 degrees HFOV, or standard with the unit 50 ppd with 127 degrees HFOV and up to 138 degrees in what they call their labs mode, which is more of an experimental type mode. There's two variable refresh rates, 72 Hz and 90 Hz, which provide smooth gameplay. And we have auto adjustable IPD ranging from 58mm up to 72mm. Local dimming delivers vibrant, true-to-life colors. That's definitely one of the first things that I noticed when I first put the headset on, which we'll come to in a minute. We have the foveated rendering, Dynamic 2, which is amazing, and then easy setup with inside-out tracking, or you can, if you so choose, expand it with lighthouse tracking, which is not really necessary with these units, and one of the benefits of the Pimax system. And it's also one of the reasons why the headset, I think, is a little bit larger, because you have the cameras on the peripheries of the system, allowing for it to track properly. But certainly if that's something that you're interested in for a little bit more precision, it's available as a separate purchase. Let's talk about the physical observations. Now, I spent a lot of time with the Crystal and the Crystal Light from Pimax, both of which really did pull me into the VR experience, which has been fantastic, and one that I never realized was going to be so immersive. So I was very, very curious when they announced the Super and started seeing the units in the hands of reviewers, and also on some of the roadshow showcasing that they were doing with the unit as well. So the question I had was, would this unit be a huge jump in visual enjoyment that Pimax has touted it would be? Now, I wasn't sure if they were going to send me out a unit, even though I'd worked with them on some of the other stuff and had experiences, as I said, with the Crystal and the Crystal Light. So let's talk about the physical characteristics of the unit and getting it set up, because, as I said, they did in the end send me a unit. The first thing you'll notice is that it is slightly smaller than the aforementioned units. Not by much, but just a little bit. And it comes with this LED light up in the front panel here, which you can set to whatever color you like. It comes default blue. I changed it to green just to match their colors for the purposes of this. You can see my smeary fingerprints there on the front, and I apologize. Oh, we're getting a little bit of reflection off that. But as I said, you can set that to any color you like. It's a minor aesthetic thing that doesn't impact the performance in any way, and probably looks cool if you're streaming. Now, based on the feel of this unit, rather than the actual measuring of the headset itself, I feel that it's just a little bit heavier than the Crystal Light. Not by much, but it's certainly noticeable, but still lighter than the original Crystal, because you don't have the batteries. Given that it's a little bit heavier, I think that's to be expected. Remember that it does have the bigger lenses, and it also has the motors for the IPD adjustment system and the eye tracking software that's also built into that package as well. So there's a little bit more than your Crystal Light. Having said that, it is much more convenient to use than the original Crystal, even though it shares some of those features that I talked about in terms of the IPD and the eye tracking and stuff like that. There's no battery system. That's been dispensed with, so there's no need to charge up ahead of time or be worried about dead batteries inhibiting your enjoyment. Some of the faff, therefore, associated with the OG Crystal is eliminated. So just like the Crystal Light, this is, if I go the right way here, this is what it kind of looks like. As I said, no battery in this. There is the top strap and, of course, the back adjustment, which is able to be tightened and loosed as desired. So it sits pretty comfortably. To get it up and running, it comes with a plug-in adapter for power. It will need to have its own power supply. There is a USB 3 cable and a direct port cable. Now, once you've downloaded the Pimax software, it's a matter then of plugging in the cables and the power, and the software should detect the unit. Now, I know that DP cables can be finicky when detecting new hardware, so I removed the crystal light and rebooted my PC before plugging in the Super, just to aid in limiting any conflicts the unit might have. Unfortunately, I didn't have any issues. The unit was detected immediately. It did require a firmware and software update on boot up, but was up and running with no issues in just a few minutes. So it was very, very easy, especially after some of the experiences I had with the original Crystal, which required a little bit more monkeying with. It didn't quite gel as well as I was expecting, and those issues seem to have been eliminated over a year later now. So first, visual impressions in terms of the experience of putting on the headset. What was my experience like when looking through those lenses? Well, a couple of things struck me immediately. The first was the field of view, which appears much bigger than the crystal light, even though it really isn't massively different. It certainly appeared much bigger than the crystal light and also the original crystal. Secondly, the brightness and the clarity of the unit also seemed much more alive and richer than the other two units. Both units run at around 280 nits of brightness, bearing in mind that direct sunlight is about 1.6 billion nits. So close to your eyes, this seems to be certainly plenty. This is on the low side in, I guess, VR development. There are some developers out there that are doing 10,000, 20,000 nits. I'm not quite sure where they want to fry your eyeballs, but either way, this seems to work for my observations anyway, in terms of brightness. So the colors are rich, the brightness is perfect, and certainly when I put on the headset for DCS World, everything popped a lot more. It looked a lot more vivid and a lot clearer than what I had experienced with the other two units. Now, I suspect this probably has more to do with the higher resolution of the 50 pixels per degree over the 35 ppd for the crystal light. Nonetheless, it was a big difference in the visual acuity and definitely was something I noticed immediately. Now, all of this was very impressive, even with the slightly lower refresh rates of the unit over its lower spec cousins, essentially. And I noticed a big difference in the cockpit experience, especially over the light. Particularly noticeable was clarity in the MFDs and moving map displays, text being more readable, along with the dials and gauges just appearing to pop a little bit more. And I think this could also be attributed to the eye tracking, which is a huge bonus, especially in flight simulation, where your eyes are doing a lot of scanning in and around the cockpit. You're what they call the 80-20 scan, 80% outside of the cockpit, 20% in. So you need things to, your eyes to tune into things very, very quickly when you're looking at gauges. So I think that's one of the reasons why, especially with that extra clarity, there was such a difference. So color contrast was also more vivid and clear, especially in black, which a lot of cockpits have. And at night, I wasn't struggling with local dimming issues. And I experienced that when I cranked up the crystal light to full brightness. And then what you get actually is, because of that local dimming issue, when you turn it up, you get like a fog effect if the brightness is turned all that way up. Now, essentially, there is no light or emission of light in parts of the cockpit, so your vision gets obscured. It's not a really pleasant experience. And then a couple of times I actually thought the lenses were foggy, but in fact, that wasn't the case. It was the just the brightness being turned up too much, and so it was washing out the black and making it difficult to see. It's not a pleasant experience for night carrier ops, for example. Not an issue with this particular super unit, which was good. Now, I did resolve that problem, I should say, in defense of the crystal light, just a matter of turning down the brightness so I wasn't getting that contrast. Again, it just wasn't set up for night flying. Comfort. Oh, we talked about this already, but as I said, it does have the back strap and it does have a top strap as well, which is adjustable. This is soft, so you can pull this off with Velcro and slot that in. If you don't have it set properly, you can get some visual quality issues. So there is, again, it's important to get that sweet spot. If you don't, you are going to have some distortions around the periphery of your vision. And there is an optional top strap for more vertical support, which I haven't installed, as you saw, and it wasn't really necessary. Now, I wear contacts, so I don't have to accommodate a pair of glasses, but I have tried wearing glasses with the other two units, the Crystal and the Crystal Light, and it's certainly acceptable. Definitely not as comfortable as without, but still perfectly acceptable if you are tied to wearing glasses for whatever reason. Now, I have heard that some users with larger heads or heavier brows can find it difficult to find the sweet spot where there is an advantage of having your pupils as close to the VR headset lenses. So I doubt very much, though, this is peculiar to Pimax's products per se, as any article of clothing or headwear, despite the best efforts of making one size fits all, it tends to be a one size fits most, but not all. Now, there are some mechanisms to possibly resolve this and things like third-party equipment. We're talking padding and other straps and things like that. But as described, some people may not find an acceptable resolution for any of these ergonomic problems. Again, I think this is an exception rather than a rule, and it represents a relatively small percentage of the population, which is unfortunate for those people that are suffering from that. Just as I said, there can be some challenges with glasses. Well, let's talk a little bit about performance. Prior to being sent the unit, Pimax reps asked me the specs of my PC to ensure it would run without bumping into problems. And once I let them know what I was operating, which is, for reference, an Intel i9 14900KF, a 4090 GPU, and 128 gigs of RAM. And completely overkill, of course. So the approval process was cemented at that point, and at this juncture, I haven't run into any problems using the unit in DCS World, and this was initially without tweaking any of DCS's VR settings that I had for the Crystal Light, which I suspect is a little bit less demanding even without the foveated viewing advantage of the Super. Now, in fairness, I'm still very much keeping an open mind about this process of tweaking, as nothing in my experience with VR at this point in the game suggests that tweaking your settings is optional. Certainly with DCS, with the detail level set to maximum using high polygon aircraft such as the Apache and detailed maps, FPS can drop to low double digits. Now, all of this, of course, is rig dependent and settings dependent and dependent on what software you've got running in the background, so on and so forth. There's a myriad of variables. And so getting apples to apples comparisons between people's rigs, even with similar specs, if you like, of hardware specs, is not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to have the same problems or have similar performance benefits. Again, it's going to come down to rig. So it's imperative that you use the foveated rendering to get any boost of performance, especially with a slightly lower end spec system, or if you're hovering around the minimum specs for this particular unit. Now, with the lab setting of upscaled 72 Hz refresh rate, I was hitting FPS rates in the low 70s. And bear in mind a couple of things. My FPS is restricted to 75 FPS within the game to match that 72 Hz, 75 Hz range. And so that's set by the in-game governor. The drawback with the upscaling that Pimax has put into it was a certain number of artifacts and some minor distortion effects, which were noticeable but tolerable. Perhaps for the individual, some people wouldn't like that. Again, if I go, though, to none of that and I really crank up the specs, it gets pretty interesting. So remember that FPS alone isn't necessarily the pure metric for performance. It's an easy one to assess because we can kind of see it, but there are other factors in play here as well. Generally, VR users will tolerate lower FPS as it doesn't detract from the visual experience in quite the same way that 2D screens may affect the performance metric. Plus, you've also got to be aware that effectively we're running 3 screens. We've got the 2 screens in the unit, plus your monitor if you're still running a monitor as well. So given the power of my particular PC, I know I can carve out more performance without needing to go straight to purchasing a 5090 a GPU to do so. as good as VR has gotten in the last few years, the tech is still an evolving one. And one area I'm a little frustrated with has less to do with Pimax and VR headsets in general, but with graphics cards right now. Now, without getting too far into the weeds here or side topics, as several high-profile reviewers have pointed out in the last 6 months or so, since the arrival of the 50 series graphics cards, it hasn't really been a huge bonus for gamers. Not only did the prices balloon well beyond MSRP, but the scarcity of the cards exacerbated the supply problems given the outrageous price point. In other words, they immediately shot up in price. There was an initial shortage of getting hold of any of the cards, and then initially there wasn't a high release of some of the third-party vendor cards. So really, it was a frustrating price point issue and supply point issue. But a further fly in the ointment, I think, has cropped up since then, and that's been the driver support that a lot of the big card reviewers and software reviewers have been talking about, especially with these NVIDIA cards, which haven't really benefited those of us who own pre-50 series cards, 40s and 30s, as expected. With the focus on AI-generated or rendered frames to boost performance over pure frame generation, it's left support for other cards a little lacking. Now, I've actually found no benefit in running the latest drivers from NVIDIA for the last 6 months. Every time I do so, try to bring up these latest drivers, I get stalls, I get jitters, and I get crashes in DCS world. And I think what is also happening there is a conflict of some kind with Steam VR, and it basically reduces DCS at times to a crawl and effectively makes it unplayable in VR. As soon as I roll back to, I think, the December drivers that came out that a lot of people were touting were stable prior to the release of the 50 series cards, I'm fine. So it's a really frustrating issue. So on that basis, it's really difficult to eke out performance for the VR headset when you're actually fighting glitches with the software. And some now are touting you need to use the NVIDIA profiler, which has been around for years, to tackle performance issues bridled by default settings in NVIDIA's GeForce controller system that, with the latest drivers, tend to benefit more or are, I guess, honed towards the 50 series cards. Now, that's not even referencing VR performance. That's just general performance. So the quagmire around NVIDIA drivers and NVIDIA cards right now has gotten pretty deep these days. So you can dabble with the profiler at your peril if you don't know what you're doing, because as uninformed tweaking could cause you more problems than you end up resolving, and you'll even need to remove the GeForce Experience software, which has a global control over certain settings, or else changes will simply revert and you'll be back to square one again. So that's a whole other topic in itself, and one that I find a little bit frustrating when you are trying to, again, etch out a little bit more performance for VR, which is demanding, especially in a headset like this, which has those high fidelity lenses and, of course, the wide field of view, even with those refresh rates being a little bit lower than the Crystal Lite and the Crystal Original. There is performance, I think, that can be gained out of here, but it's been a little bit of a challenge initially to get the best out of it. Let's talk about conclusions. So without any doubt, the Super is a significant improvement in visual quality over the Crystal Lite and certainly the original Crystal. The pedigree is there, though, with the features such as the Auto IPD, foveated rendering, and eye tracking, which it shares with the original Crystal. And these are critical ones for simulation racing and flying, especially for performance boosting with so much resolution. The larger size of the lenses and the 50 pixels per degree really do boost the visual clarity, and it's apparent from the moment you put the headset on. I'm very, very curious to know how the 57 ppd lenses work and whether the cost of purchasing them is of value. Will you get even more out of that, or is the price point redundant? Again, it's hard to know at this point because I haven't tried that. What I will say is that given the price point, I don't think you should immediately trade in or go out and buy a Super if you already own a Crystal or a Crystal Lite. Now, again, while the difference is notable, I don't think it's so mind-blowing that it reduces the other units into obsolescence. It's nice, but it's not so far up there that it warrants a panic decision or a need to immediately get rid of your older crystals for this new one. On the contrary, I think the light still represents one of the best bangs for your buck in terms of performance and visual clarity. Especially for those on a budget, the light represents a foray into the VR world for you. You'll get your money's worth as an experience, in my opinion. I think the Crystal Light is a really good headset for those of you who are looking to embark on one of the greatest experiences that you can have for virtual simulation, particularly in racing and also flight simulation, that few other headsets, based on what I've seen and reviewed and experienced, can offer. Now, as hinted at, one of the challenges in the business of flight simulation and simulation games in general is that it becomes kind of self-competing. You end up talking to yourself into buying things that you feel you need to, again, embellish or enhance the experience. If only I had this periphery, I could. If only I could upgrade my graphics card, I could. And soon your home office has morphed into something of a Frankenstein's monster of equipment as you chase performance and immersion. VR is one of the few pieces of kit, I think, which provides a level of immersion above and beyond what most other pieces of equipment are going to give you, except maybe a HOTAS and certainly the computer to run it. So investing in the tech is probably worth it, as long as, that is, your PC specs can support it, and then refer back to my previous point about the self-competing challenges and the pursuit of more, because as you want that piece of equipment, can I run it? And that's the challenge with VR. Now, if price point isn't an issue and you simply want one of the best visual experiences in the business, then the Crystal Super makes sense, and it is probably for you. Don't take my word for it, of course. I'm only one reviewer. There are lots of reviewers out there. There's a lot of tech specs that you can do some comparatives with. But it seems to me right now, this is probably, based on what I've seen, and certainly based on what I've experienced, this is probably the king of VR headsets right now. And I'm absolutely loving it. What I'm not loving, though, of course, is the challenge of getting just a little bit more performance out of it. Though it's certainly possible, it certainly is amazing, and it's certainly something that I'm willing to let slide, at least until some of these things are naturally resolved and can help benefit. Obviously, games like DCS World are ones that are evolving. The team are continually working on VRAM issues and optimization for their maps, optimization for the core engine, and so on and so forth. And let's hope, I'm certainly very positive and hopeful, that performance upgrades that are going to come with the game engine are going to coincide with the performance upgrades and software development that is in operation for VR and the GPU issue and general high performance computers, which, you know, these days are getting better and better, barring some of the glitches that we described. Well, I hope this review was somewhat helpful. I'm going to continue using it. I'm going to continue sharing my specs, my experiences with it, and let you know how things go in the interim. We'll see you next time. I got some flying to do.